Cancer. This shaking keeps me steady, I should know. What falls away is always and is near. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. I learn by going where I have to go. Theodore Rothko. Chapter 1. McCarthy. 1. Jonesy almost shot the guy when he came out of the woods. How close? Another pound on the Garand's trigger, maybe just a half. Later, hyped on the clarity that sometimes comes to the horrified mind, he wished he had shot before he saw the orange cap and the orange flagman's vest. Killing Richard McCarthy couldn't have hurt, and it might have helped. Killing McCarthy might have saved them all. 2. Pete and Henry had gone to Gosselin's Market, the closest store, to stock upon bread, canned goods and beer, the real essential. They had plenty for another 2 days, but the radio said there might be snow coming. Henry had already gotten his deer, and Jonesy had an idea Pete cared a lot more about making sure of the beer supply than he did about getting his own deer. For Pete Moore, hunting was a hobby, beer a religion. The beaver was out there someplace, but Jonesy hadn't heard the crack of the rifle any closer than 5 miles, so he guessed that the beaver, like him, was still waiting. There was a stand in an old maple about 70 yards from the camp, and that was where Jonesy was, sipping coffee and reading a Robert Parker mystery novel, when he heard something coming and put the book and the thermos aside. In other years he might have spilled the coffee in his excitement, but not this time. This time he even took a few seconds to screw on the thermos's bright red stopper. The 4 of them had been coming up here to hunt in the first week of November for 26 years. If you counted in the times Beeve's dad had taken them, and Jonesy had never bothered with the tree stand until now. None of them had. It was too confining. This year Jonesy had staked it out. The others thought they knew why, but they only knew half of it. In mid-March of 2001, Jonesy had been struck by a car while crossing a street in Cambridge, not far from John Jay College, where he taught. He had fractured his skull, broken 2 ribs, and suffered a shattered hip, which had been replaced with some exotic combination of Teflon and metal. The man who had struck him was a retired BU history professor who was, according to his lawyer, anyway in the early stages of Alzheimer's, more to be pitied than punished. So often, Jonesy thought, there was no one to blame when the dust cleared. And even if there was, what good did it do? You still had to live with what was left and console yourself with the fact that people told him every day until they forgot the whole thing, that was, it could have been worse. And it could have been. His head was hard, and the crack in it healed. He had no memory of the hour or so leading up to his accident near Harvard Square. But the rest of his mental equipment was fine. His ribs healed in a month. The hip was worst, but he was off the crutches by October. And now his limp only became appreciable towards the end of the day. Pete, Henry, and Beeve thought it was hip, and only the hip that caused him to opt for the tree stand instead of the damp cold woods. And the hip was certainly a factor. Just not the only one. What he had kept from them was that he now had little interest in shooting deer. It would have dismayed them. Hell, it dismayed Jonesy himself. But there it was, something new in his existence that he hadn't even suspected until they had actually gotten up here on November 11th and he had uncased the Garand. He wasn't revolted by the idea of hunting. Not at all. He just had no real urge to do it. Death had brushed by him on a sunny day in March, and Jonesy had no desire to call it back, even if he were dealing rather than receiving. 3. What surprised him was that he still liked being at camp, in some ways better than ever. Talking at night, books, politics, the shit they've gotten up to as kids, their plans for the future. They were in their 30s, still young enough to have plans, plenty of them, and the old bond was still strong. And the days were good too. The hours in the tree stand when he was alone, He took a sleeping bag and slid into it up to his hips when he got cold, and a book and a Walkman. After the first day, he stopped listening to the Walkman, discovering that he liked the music of the woods better. The silk of the wind in the pines, the rust of the crows. He would read a little, drink coffee, read a little more, sometimes work his way out of the sleeping bag. It was red as a stoplight, and piss off the edge of the platform. He was a man with a big family and a large circle of colleagues. A gregarious man who enjoyed all the various relationships the family and the colleagues entailed. And the students, of course, the endless stream of students, and balanced them well. It was only out there, up there, that he realized the attraction of silence was still real, still strong. It was like meeting an old friend after a long absence. "You sure you want to be up there, man?" Henry had asked him yesterday morning. "I mean, you're welcome to come out with me. We won't overuse that leg of yours, I promise." "Leave him alone," Pete said. "He likes it up there, don't you, Jones boy?" "Sort of," he said, unwilling to say much more. How much he actually did like it, for instance. Some things you didn't feel safe telling even your closest friends, and sometimes your closest friends knew anyway. "Tell you something," the beef said. He picked up a pencil and began to gnaw lightly at it. His closest, dearest trick, going all the way back to the first grade. "I like coming back and seeing you there. Like a lookout in the crow's nest in one of those fucking hornblower books. Keeping an eye out, you know." "Sail ho!" Jonesy had said, and they all laughed. But Jonesy knew what the beef meant. He felt it. Keeping an eye out. Just thinking his thoughts and keeping an eye out for ships or sharks, or who knew what. His hip hurt coming back down. The pack, with his shit in it, was heavy on his back, and he felt slow and clumsy on the wooden rungs nailed to the trunk of the maple, but that was okay. Good, in fact. Things changed. But only a fool believed they only changed for the worse. That was what he thought then. 4. When he heard the whicker of the moving bush and the soft snap of a twig, sounds he never questioned were those of an approaching deer. Jonesy thought of something his father said. "You can't make yourself be lucky." Lindsay Jones was one of life's losers and had said few things worth committing to memory, but that was one. And here was the proof of it again. Days after deciding he had finished with deer hunting, here came one. And a big one by the sound. A buck. Almost surely, maybe one as big as a man. That it was a man never so much as crossed Jonesy's mind. This was an unincorporated township 50 miles north of Rangeley, and the nearest hunters were 2 hours' walk away. The nearest paved road, the one which eventually took you to Gosselin's market, bear bait, out of state, licks, lottery, ticks, was at least 16 miles away. Well, he thought, it isn't as if I took a vow or anything. No, he hadn't taken a vow. Next November, he might be up with a Nikon instead of a Garand. But it wasn't next year yet, and the rifle was at hand. He had no intention of looking a gift deer in the mouth. Jonesy screwed the red stopper into the thermos of coffee and put it aside. Then he pushed the sleeping bag off his lower body like a big quilted sock, winted at the stiffness in his hip as he did it, and grabbed his gun. There was no need to chamber around, producing that loud, deer-frightening click. Old habits die hard, and the gun was ready to fire as soon as he thumbed off the safety. This he did when he was solidly on his feet. The old wild excitement was gone, but there was a residue. His pulse was up, and he welcomed the rise. In the wake of his accident, he welcomed all such reactions. It was as if there were two of him now. The one before he had been knocked flat in the street, and the warrior, older fellow who had awakened in the mass general, if you would call that slow, drugged awareness being awake. Sometimes he still heard a voice. Whose, he didn't know, but his, calling out, "Please stop, I can't stand this. Give me a shot. Where's Marcy? I want Marcy." He thought of it as Death's voice. Death had missed him in the street and then came to the hospital to finish the job. Death, masquerading as a man, or perhaps it had been a woman. It was hard to tell. In pain, someone who said Marcy but meant Jonesy. The idea passed. All of the funny ideas he had had in the hospital eventually passed, but it left a residue. Caution was the residue. He had no memory of Henry calling and telling him to watch himself for the next little while. And Henry hadn't reminded him, but since then, Jonesy had watched himself. He was careful. Maybe because death was out there, and maybe sometimes it called your name. But the past was the past. He had survived his brush with death, and nothing was dying here this morning but a deer, a buck, he hoped, who had strolled in the wrong direction. The sound of the rustling brush and the snapping twigs was coming toward him from the southwest, which meant he wouldn't have to shoot around the trunk of the maple. Good, and put him upwind. Even better. Most of the maple leaves had fallen, and he had a good, if not perfect, sight line through the interlacing branches. Jonesy raised the garand, settled the butt plate into the hollow of his shoulder, and prepared to shoot himself a conversation piece. What saved McCarthy, at least temporarily, was Jonesy's disenchantment with hunting. What almost got McCarthy killed was a phenomenon George Kilroy, a friend of his father, had called eye fever. Eye fever, Kilroy claimed, was a form of a buck fever, and was probably the second most common cause of hunting accidents. First is drink, said George Kilroy, and like Jonesy's father, Kilroy knew a bit on that subject as well. First is always drink. Kilroy said that victims of eye fever were uniformly astounded to discover they had shot a fence post, or a passing car, or the broadside of a barn, or their own hunting partner. In many cases, the partner was a spouse, a sib, or a child. But I saw it, they would protest, and most of them, according to Kilroy, could pass a lie detector test on the subject. They had seen a deer, or the bear, or the wolf, or just a grouse flip-flapping through the high autumn grass. They had seen it. What happened, according to Kilroy, was that these hunters were afflicted by an anxiety to make the shot, to get over with one way or the other. This anxiety became so strong that the brain persuaded the eye that it saw what was not yet visible in order to end the tension. This was eye fever. And although Jonesy was aware of no particular anxiety, his finger had been perfectly steady as he screwed the red stopper back into the throat of the thermos. He admitted later to himself, yes, he might have fallen prey to the malady. For one moment, he saw the buck clearly at the end of the tunnel, made by the interlocking branches, as clearly as he had seen any of the previous 16 deer, 6 bucks, 10 does, he had brought down over the years at Hole in the Wall. He saw its brown head, one eye so dark it was almost the black of a jeweler's velvet, even part of its rack. Shoot now, part of him cried. It was Jonesy from the other side of the accident, the whole Jonesy. That one had spoken more frequently in the last month or so, as he began to approach some mythical state which people who had never been hit by a car blithely referred to as total recovery. But he had never spoken as loudly as he did now. This was a command, almost a shout. And his finger did tighten on the trigger. It never put on that last pound of pressure, or perhaps it only would have taken another half, or paltry 8 ounces, but it did tighten. The voice that stopped him was that second Jonesy, the one who had awakened in Mass General, doped and disoriented and in pain, not sure of anything more except that someone wanted something to stop. Someone couldn't stand it. Not without a shot. Anyway, that someone wanted Marcy. No, not yet. Wait. Watch. This new cautious Jonesy said. And that was the voice he listened to. He froze in place, most of his weight thrown forward on his good left leg. Rifle raised, barrel angled down that interlacing tunnel of light at a cool 35 degrees. The first flakes of snow came skating down out of the white sky just then, and as they did, Jonesy saw a bright vertical line of orange below the deer's head. It was as if the snow had somehow conjured it up. For a moment, perception simply gave up, and what he was seeing over the barrel of his gun became only an unconnected jumble, like paints swirled all together on an artist's palette. There was no deer and no man, not even any woods, just a puzzling and untidy jumble of black, brown, and orange. Then there was more orange, and in a shape that made sense. It was a hat, the kind of flaps you could fold down to cover your ears. The out-of-staters bought them at LL Beans for $44 each with a little tag inside that said, "Proudly made in the USA by Union Labor." You could pick one at the Goslins for $7. The tag in Goslin's cab just said, "Made in Bangladesh." They had brought everything into horrible "oh God" focus. The brown he had mistaken for Buck's head was the front of the man's wool jacket. The black jeweler's velvet of the buck's eye was a button, and the antlers were only more branches belonging to the very tree in which he was standing. The man was unwise. Jonesy could not quite bring himself to the word crazy to be wearing a brown coat in the woods. But Jonesy was still at a loss to understand how he himself could have made a mistake of such potentially horrifying consequence. Because the man was also wearing an orange cap, wasn't he? And a bright orange flagman's vest as well, over the admittedly unwise brown coat. The man was a pound of finger pressure from death, maybe less. It came home to him in a visceral way then, knocking him clean out of his own body. For a terrible, brilliant moment he never forgot, he was neither Jonesy number 1, the confident pre-accident Jonesy, or Jonesy number 2, the more tentative survivor who spent so much of his time in a tiresome state of physical discomfort and mental confusion. For that moment, he was some other Jonesy, an invisible presence looking at a gunman standing on a platform in a tree. The gunman's hair was short and already graying, his face lined around the smooth, beard speckled on the cheeks and haggard. The gunman was on the verge of using his weapon. Snow had begun to dance around his head and light on his untucked brown flannel shirt, and he was on the verge of shooting a man in a brown cap and vest of very sort he would have been wearing himself if he had elected to go into the woods with the beaver instead of up into this tree. He fell back into himself with a thud, exactly as one fell back into one's seat after taking a car over a bad bump at a high speed. To his horror, he realized he was still tracking the man below with a garand, as if some stubborn alligator deep in his brain refused to let go of this idea that the man in the brown coat was prey. Worse, he couldn't seem to make his finger relax on the rifle's trigger. There was even an awful second or two when he thought he was actually still squeezing, inexorably eating up those last few ounces between him and the greatest mistake of his life. He later came to accept that at least had been an illusion, something akin to the feeling of getting to rolling backward in your stopped car when you glimpse a slowly moving car beside you, out of the corner of your eye. No, he was just frozen. But that was bad enough. That was hell. "Jonesy, you think too much," Pete liked to say when he caught Jonesy staring out in the middle distance, no longer tracking the conversation. And what he probably meant was, "Jonesy, you imagine too much," and that was very likely true. Certainly he was imagining too much. Now he stood up here in the middle of the tree and the season's first snow, hair leaping up in tufts, finger locked on the garand's trigger, not tightening still, as he had for a moment feared, but not loosening either. The man almost below him now, the garand's gun sight on top of the orange cap, the man's life on an invisible wire between the garand's muzzle and that cap. The man may be thinking about trading his car, or cheating on his wife, or buying his oldest daughter a pony. Jonesy later had reason to know McCarthy had been thinking about none of those things, but of course not then, not in the tree with his forefinger a frozen curl around the trigger of his rifle, and not knowing what Jonesy had not known as he stood on the curb in Cambridge with his briefcase in one hand and copy of the Boston Phoenix under his arm, namely that death was in the neighborhood, or perhaps even death, a hurrying figure like something escaped from an early Ingmar Bergman film. Something carried a concealed implement in the coarse folds of its robe, scissors perhaps, or a scalpel. And the worst of it was that the man would not die, or at least not at once. He would fall down and lie there screaming, as Jonesy had lain screaming in the street. He couldn't remember screaming, but of course he had. He had been told this and had no reason to disbelieve it. Screaming his fucking head off, most likely, and what if the man in the brown coat and orange accessories started screaming for mercy? Surely he would not. Not really, but Jonesy's mind might report screams of mercy. If there was eye fever, if he could look at man's brown coat and see it as a deer's head, Then there was likely the auditory equivalent as well. To hear a man screaming and know they were the reason. Dear God, no, and still his finger would not loosen. What broke his paralysis was both simple and unexpected. About 10 paces from the base of Jonesy's tree, the man in the brown coat fell down. Jonesy heard the pained, surprised sound he made, morph, or what it sounded like, and his finger released the trigger without his even thinking about it. The man was down on his hands and knees. His brown-gloved fingers, brown gloves, another mistake. This guy almost could have gone out with the sign reading "Shoot me" taped on his back, Jonesy thought. Spread on the ground, which had already begun to whiten. As the man got up again, he began to speak aloud in a fretful, wondering voice. Jonesy didn't realize at first that he was also weeping. Oh dear, the man said as he worked his way back to the standing position. He swayed on his feet as if drunk. Jonesy knew that man in the woods. Men away from their families for a week or a weekend got up to all sorts of small wickedness. Drinking at 10 in the morning was one of the most common. But Jonesy didn't think this guy was drunk. No reason, just a vibe. Oh dear. And then, as he began to walk again, snow. Now it's snow, please God. Oh God, now it's snow. Oh dear. His first couple of steps were lurching and unsure. Jonesy had about decided that his vibe was incorrect. The guy was loaded. And then the fellow's gait smoothed out, and he began to walk a little more evenly. He was scratching at his right cheek. He passed directly beneath the stand. For a moment he wasn't a man at all, but only a round circle of orange cap with brown shoulders to either side of it. His voice drifted up, liquid and full of tears, mostly "oh dear," with the occasional "oh God," or "now it's snow" thrown in for salt. Jonesy stood where he was, waiting as the guy first disappeared directly beneath the stand, then came out on the other side. He pivoted without being aware of it to keep the plodding man in view. Nor was he aware that he had lowered his rifle to his side, even pausing long enough to put the safety back on. Jonesy didn't call out, and he supposed he knew why. Simple guilt. He was afraid that the man down there would take one look at him and see the truth in Jonesy's eyes. Even through his tears and the thickening snow, the man would see that Jonesy had been up there with his gun pointed, that Jonesy had almost shot him. 20 paces beyond the tree, the man stopped and only stood there. His gloved right hand raised to his brow, shielding his eyes from the snow. Jonesy realized he had seen hole in the wall, had probably realized he was on the actual path, too. Oh dear and oh God stopped, and the guy began to run toward the sound of the generator, rocking from side to side like a man on the deck of a ship. Jonesy could hear the stranger's short, sharp gasp for breath as he pounded towards the roomy cabin, with the lazy curl of smoke rising from the chimney and fading almost at once into the snow. Jonesy began to work his way down the rungs nailed to the trunk of the maple, with his gun slung over his shoulder. The thought that the man might present some sort of danger did not occur to him. Not then. He simply didn't want to leave the Garand, which was a fine gun, out in the snow. His hip had stiffened, and by the time he got to the foot of the tree, the man he had almost shot had made it nearly all the way to the cabin door, which was unlocked, of course. No one locked up, not way out here. 5. About 10 feet from the granite slab that served as a hole in the wall's front stoop, the man in the brown coat and orange hat fell down again. His hat tumbled off, revealing a sweaty clump of thinning brown hair. He stayed on one knee for a moment, head lowered. Jonesy could hear his harsh, fast breathing. The man picked up his cap, and just as he set it back on his head, Jonesy hailed him. The man staggered to his feet and turned tipsily. Jonesy's first impression was that man's face was very long, that he had almost what people meant when they called someone horse-faced. Then, as Jonesy got closer, hitching a little but not really limping, and that was good because the ground underfoot was getting slippery fast, he realized the guy's face wasn't particularly long at all. He was just very scared and very, very pale. The red patch on his cheek where he had been scratching stood out brightly. The relief that came over him when he saw Jonesy hurrying toward him was large and immediate. Jonesy almost laughed at himself, standing up there on the platform in the tree and worrying about the guy reading his eyes. This man wasn't into reading faces and clearly had no interest in where Jonesy had come from or what he might have been doing. This man looked like he wanted to throw his arm around Jonesy's neck and cover him with big gooey kisses. "Thank God!" the man cried. He held out one hand toward Jonesy and shuffled toward him through the thin icing of new snow. "Oh, gee, thank God. I'm lost. I've been lost in the woods since yesterday. I thought I was going to die out here. I... His feet slipped and Jonesy grabbed his upper arms. He was a big man, taller than Jonesy, who stood 6'2", and broader as well. Nevertheless, Jonesy's first impression was of his insubstantialness, as if the man's fear had somehow scooped him out and left him light as a milkweed pod. "Easy, fella," Jonesy said. "Easy, you're all right now. You're okay. Let's just get you inside and get you warm. How would that be?" As if the word warm had been his cue. The man's teeth began to chatter. Sure." He tried to smile, without much success. Jonesy was again struck by his extreme pallor. It was cold out here this morning, upper 20s at best, but the guy's cheeks were all ashes and lead. The only color in his face other than the red patch was the brown crescents under his eyes. Jonesy got an arm around the man's shoulder, suddenly swept by an absurd and sappy tenderness for this stranger, an emotion so strong it was like his first junior high school crush, Mary Jo Martineau, in a sleeveless white blouse and a straight knee-length denim skirt. He was now absolutely sure the man hadn't been drinking. It was fear, or maybe exhaustion, rather than booze, that made him unsteady on his feet. Yet there was a smell on his breath, something like bananas. It reminded Jonesy of the ether he sprayed into the carburetor of his first car, a Vietnam-era Ford, to get it to crank over on cold mornings. "Get you inside, right?" "Yeah, cold. Thank God you came along. Is this my place?" "No, a friend's." Jonesy opened the varnished oak door and helped the man over the threshold. The stranger gasped at the feel of the warm air and a flush began to rise in his cheeks. Jonesy was relieved to see there was some blood in him after all. 6. Hole in the wall was pretty grand by deep woods standards. You came in on the single big downstairs room, kitchen, dining room and living room all in one, but there were 2 bedrooms behind it and another upstairs under the single eave. The big room was filled with the scent of pine and its mellow varnished glow. There was a Navajo rug on the floor and a Micmac hanging on one wall which depicted brave little stick hunters surrounding an enormous bear. A plain oak table long enough to accommodate 8 places defined the dining area. There was a wood stove in the kitchen and a fireplace in the living area when both were going. The place made you feel stupid with the heat even if it was 20 below outside. The west wall was all window, giving a view of the long, steep slope which fell off to the west. There had been a fire there in the 70s and the dead trees stood black and twisted in the thickening snow. Jonesy, Pete, Henry and Beeve called this slope the Gulch because that's what Beeve's dad and his friends had called it. "Oh God, thank you. And thank you too," the man in the orange hat said to Jonesy. And when Jonesy grinned, that was a lot of thank yous. The man laughed shrilly as if to say yes, he knew it. It was a funny thing to say and he couldn't help it. He began to take deep breaths for a few moments, looking like one of those exercise gurus you saw on high-number cable. On every exhale, he talked. "God, I really thought I was done for last night. It was so cold, and the damp air, I remember that. I remember thinking, oh boy, oh dear, what if there's snow coming after all? I got coughing, I couldn't stop. Something came and I thought, I have to stop coughing. If there's a bear or something, I'll, provoke it or something. And after a while, it just, went away on its own." "You saw a bear in the night?" Jonesy was both fascinated and appalled. He had heard there were bears up there. Old man Goslin and his pickle barrel buddies at the store loved to tell bear stories, particularly to the out-of-staters, but the idea that this man, lost and on his own, had been menaced by one in the night was keenly horrible. It was like hearing a sailor talk about a sea monster. "I don't know what it was," the man said, and suddenly shot Jonesy a sideward look of cunning that Jonesy didn't like and couldn't read. "I can't say for sure, but by then there was no more lightning." "Lightning too," Man! If not for Guy's obviously genuine distress, Jonesy would have wondered if he wasn't getting his leg pulled. In truth, he wondered it a little anyway. Dry lightning, I guess, the man said. Jonesy could almost see him shrugging it off. He scratched at the red place on his cheek, which might have been a touch of frostbite. See it in winter, it means there's a storm on the way. And you saw this last night. I guess so. The man gave him another quick sideways glance, but this time Jonesy saw no slyness in it, and guessed he had been never before. He only saw exhaustion. It's all mixed up in my mind. My stomach's been hurting ever since I got lost. It always hurts when I'm scared. Ever since I was a little kid. And he was like a little kid, Jonesy thought. Looking everywhere at once with perfect unself-consciousness, Jonesy led the guy toward the couch in front of the fireplace. And he let himself be led. A skirt. He even said a skirt instead of afraid, like a kid. A little kid. Give me a coat, Jonesy said. And the guy first unbuttoned the buttons and then reached for the zipper under them. Jonesy thought again of how he had thought he was looking at a deer, at a buck for Christ's sakes. He had mistaken one of those buttons for an eye and had damned near put a bullet through it. The guy got the zipper halfway down and then it stuck, one side of the little gold mouth choking on the cloth. He looked at it, gawked at it, really, as if he had never seen such a thing before. And when Jonesy reached for the zipper, the man dropped his hand to his sides and simply let Jonesy reach, as a first grader would stand and let the teacher put matters right when he got his galoshes on the wrong feet or his jacket on inside out. Jonesy got the little gold mouth started again and pulled it the rest of the way down. Outside the window wall, the gulch was disappearing, although you could see the black scrawled shape of the trees. Almost 30 years they had come up here together for the hunting. Almost 30 years without a single miss, and in none of that time had there been a snow heavier than the occasional squall. It looked like all that was about to change. Although how could you tell? These days, guys on the radio and TV made 4 inches of fresh powder sound like the next ice age. For a moment the guy only stood there with his jacket hanging open and snow melting around his boots on the polished wooden floor, looking up at the rafters with his mouth open, and yes, he was like a big 6-year-old or like Duddits. You almost expected to see mittens dangling from the cuffs of his jacket on clips. He shrugged out of his coat in that perfectly recognizable child's way, simply slumping his shoulders once it was unzipped or letting it fall. If Jonesy hadn't been there to catch it, it would have gone on the floor and gotten right to work sopping up the puddles of the melting snow. "What's that?" he asked. For a moment, Jonesy had no idea what the guy was talking about, and then he traced the stranger's gaze to the bit of weaving which hung from the center rafter. It was colorful, red and green with shoots of canary yellow as well, and it looked like a spider web. "It's a dream catcher," Jonesy said. "An Indian charm. Supposed to keep the nightmares away, I guess. Is it yours?" Jonesy didn't know if he meant the whole place. Perhaps the guy hadn't been listening before, or just the dream catcher. But in either case, the answer was the same. "No, my friends. We come up hunting every year." "How many of you?" The man was shivering, holding his arms crisscrossed over his chest and cupping his elbows in his palms as he watched Jonesy hang his coat on the tree by the door. 4. Beaver. This is his camp. He's out hunting now. I don't know if the snow will bring him back in or not. Probably it will. Pete and Henry went to the store. Gosling's, that one. Uh-huh. Come on over here and sit on the couch. Jonesy led him to the couch, a ridiculously long sectional. Such things have gone out of style decades ago, but it didn't smell too bad and nothing had infested it. Style and taste didn't matter much at hole in the wall. "Stay put now," he said, and left the man sitting there, shivering and shaking, with his hands clasped between his knees. His jeans had the sausagey look they get when they are long johns underneath, and still he shook and shivered. But the heat had brought on an absolute flood of color. Instead of looking like a corpse, the stranger now looked like a diphtheria victim. Pete and Henry were doubling in the bigger of the 2 downstairs bedroom. Jonesy ducked in, opened the cedar chest on the left of the door, and pulled out one of the 2 down comforters folded up inside. As he recrossed the living room to where the man sat shivering on the couch, Jonesy realized he hadn't asked the most elementary question of all, the one even the 6-year-olds who wouldn't get their own zippers down asked. As he spread the comforter over the stranger on the outsized camp couch, he asked, "What's your name?" and realized he almost knew. "McCoy? McCann?" The man Jonesy had almost shot looked up at him at once, pulling the comforter up around his neck. The brown patches under his eyes were filling in purple. "McCarthy," he said. "Richard McCarthy." His hand, surprisingly plump and white without his glove, crept out from beneath the coverlet like a shy animal. "You are?" "Gary Jones," he said, and shook the hand with the one which had almost pulled the trigger. "Folks mostly call me Jonesy." "Thanks, Jonesy." McCarthy looked at him earnestly. "I think you saved my life." "Oh, I don't know about that," Jonesy said. He looked at the red patch again. Frostbite. Just a small patch. Frostbite? Had to be. Chapter 2. The Beeve. 1. "You know I can't call anyone, don't you?" Jonesy said. "The phone lines don't come anywhere near here. There is a Jenny for the electric, but that's all." McCarthy, only his head showing above the comforter, nodded. "I was hearing the generator, but you know how it is when you're lost. Noises are funny. Sometimes the sound seems to be coming from your left or your right. Then you would swear it's behind you and you better turn back." Jonesy nodded, although he did not in fact know how it was, unless you counted the week or so immediately after his accident, time he had spent wandering in the fog of drugs and pain. He had never been lost. "I'm trying to think what'd be the best thing," Jonesy said. "I guess when Pete and Henry get back, we better take you out. How many in your party?" It seemed McCarthy had to think. That, added to the unsteady way he had been walking, solidified Jonesy's impression that the man was in shock. He wondered that one night lost in the woods would do that. He wondered if it would do to him. "4, McCarthy said, after a minute to think. "Just like you guys. We were hunting in pairs. I was with a friend of mine, Steve Otis. He's a lawyer like me, down in Skowhegan. We're all from Skowhegan, you know. And this week for us, it's a big deal." Jonesy nodded, smiling. "Yeah, same here." "Anyway, I guess I just wandered off." He shook his head. "I don't know, I was hearing Steve over my right, sometimes seeing his west through the trees, and then I just don't know, I got thinking about stuff. I guess one thing the woods are great for is thinking about stuff, and then I was on my own. I guess I tried to backtrack, but then it got dark." He shook his head yet again. "It's all mixed up in my mind, but yeah, there were 4 of us. I guess that's one thing I'm sure of. Me and Steve, and Nat Roper and Nat's sister, Becky. They must be worried sick." McCarthy looked first startled, then apprehensive. This was clearly a new idea for him. "Yeah, they must be. Of course they are. Oh dear, oh gee." Jonesy had to restrain a smile at this. When he not going, McCarthy sounded a little like a character in the movie Fargo. "So we better take you out, if that is." "I don't want to be a bother. We'll take you out, if we can. I mean, this weather came in fast." "It sure did," McCarthy said bitterly. "You'd think they would go better with all their darn satellites and Doppler radar and gosh knows what else. So much for fair and seasonably cold, huh?" Jonesy looked at the man under the comforter, just the flushed face and the thatch of thinning brown hair showing, with some perplexity. The forecast, he had heard, he, Pete, Henry and Beeve, has been full of the prospect of snow for the last 2 days. Some of the prognosticators hedged their bets, saying the snow could change over to rain, but the fellow on the Castle Rock radio station that morning, WCAS, was the only radio that they could get up here, and even that was thin and jumbled with static. Had been talking about a fast-moving Alberta clipper, 6 or 8 inches, or maybe a nor'easter to follow, if the temperature stayed down and the low didn't go out to sea. Jonesy didn't know where McCarthy had gotten his weather forecasts, but it sure hadn't been WCAS. The guy was just mixed up, that was most likely it, and had every right to be. "You know, I could put on some soup. How would that be, Mr. McCarthy?" McCarthy smiled gratefully. "I think that would be pretty fine," he said. "My stomach hurt last night and something fierce this morning, but I feel better now." "Stress," Jonesy said. I would be puking my guts, probably filling my pants as well. I didn't throw up, McCarthy said. I'm pretty sure I didn't, but another shake of the head. It was like a nervous tick with him. I don't know, the way things are jumbled, it's like a nightmare I had. The nightmare's over, Jonesy said. He felt a little foolish saying such a thing, a little auntie-ish. But it was clear the guy needed reassurance. Good, McCarthy said. Thank you, and I would like some soup. There's tomato, chicken, and I think maybe a can of chunky sirloin. What do you fancy? Chicken, McCarthy said. My mother always said chicken soup was the thing when you're not feeling your best. He grinned as he said it, and Jonesy tried to keep the shock off his face. McCarthy's teeth were white and even, really too even to be anything but capped, given the man's age, which had to be 45 or thereabouts. But at least 4 of them were missing, the canines on top, what Jonesy's father had called the vampire teeth, and the 2 right front on the bottom. Jonesy didn't know what those are called. He knew one thing though, McCarthy wasn't aware they were gone. No one who knew about such gaps in the line of the teeth could expose them so unself-consciously, even under circumstances like this, or so Jonesy believed. He felt a sick little chill rush through his gut, a telephone call from nowhere. He turned toward the kitchen before McCarthy could see his face change and wonder what was wrong. Maybe ask what was wrong. 1 order chicken soup coming right up. How about a grilled cheese to go with it? If it's no trouble, and call me Richard, will you? Or Rick, that's even better. When people save my life, I like to get on a first-name basis with them as soon as possible. Rick it is, for sure. Better get those teeth fixed before you step in front of another jury, Rick. The feeling that something was wrong here was very strong. It was that click, just as almost guessing McCarthy's name had been. He was a long way from wishing he had shot the man when he had the chance, but he was already starting to wish McCarthy had stayed the hell away from his tree and out of his life. He had the soup on the stove and was making the cheese sandwiches when the first gust of wind arrived. A big whoop that made the cabin creak and raised the snow in a furious sheet. For a moment, even the black scrawled shape of the trees in the gulch were erased, and there was nothing outside the big window but white. It was as if someone had set up a drive-in movie screen out there. For the first time, Jonesy felt a thread of unease, not just about Pete and Henry, presumably on their way from Gosselin's in Henry's scout, but for the beaver. You would have said that if anybody knew these woods, it would have been the beaver, but nobody knew anything in a whiteout. All bets were off. That was another of his ne'er-do-well father's sayings. Probably not as good as you can't make yourselves be lucky, but not bad. The sound of the Jenny might help Beeve find his way, but as McCarthy had pointed out, sounds had a way of deceiving you, especially if the wind started kicking up, as it had now apparently decided to do. His mom had taught him the dozen basic things he knew about cooking, and one of them had to do with the art of making grilled cheese sandwiches. Lay in the little mustards first, she said, mustards being Janet Jones for mustard. And then butter the goddamn bread, not the skillet. Butter the skillet and all's you got, fried bread with some cheese in it. He had never understood how the difference between where you put the butter, on the bread or in the skillet, could change the ultimate results. But he always did it his mother's way, even though it was a pain in the ass buttering the tops of the sandwiches while the bottoms cooked. No more would he have left his rubber boots on once he was in the house, because his mother had always said, they draw your feet. He had no idea just what that meant, but even now, as the man going on 40, he took off his boots as soon as he was in the door, so they wouldn't draw his feet. I think I might have one of these babies myself, Jonesy said, and laid the sandwiches in the skillet, butter side down. The soup had begun to simmer, and it smelled fine, like comfort. Good idea. I certainly hope your friends are all right. Yeah, Jonesy said. He gave the soup a stir. Where's your place? Well, we used to hunt in Mars Hill at a place Nat and Becky's uncle owned, but some God-blessed idiot burned it down 2 summers ago, drinking and then getting careless with the old smokes. That's what the fire marshal said anyway. Jonesy nodded. Not an uncommon story. The insurance paid the value of the place but we had nowhere to hunt. I thought probably that'd be the end of it, and then Steve found this nice place over in Kenya. I think it's probably a unincorporated township, just another part of the Jefferson Tract. But Kenya's what they call it, the few people who live there. Do you know where I mean? I know it, Jonesy said, speaking through lips that felt oddly numb. He was getting another one of those telephone calls from nowhere. Hole in the Wall was about 20 miles east of Gosselins. Kenya was maybe 30 miles to the west of the market. That was 50 miles in all. Was he supposed to believe that the man sitting on the couch, with his head sticking out of the down comforter, had wandered 50 miles since becoming lost the previous afternoon? It was absurd. It was impossible. "Smells good," McCarthy said. And it did, but Jonesy no longer felt hungry. 3. He was just bringing the chow over to the couch when he heard feet stamping on the stone outside the door. A moment later, a door opened and Beaver came in. Snow swirled around his legs in a dancing mist. "Jesus Christ bananas," the Beav said. Pete had once made a list of Beavisms, and Jesus Christ bananas was high on it, along with such standbys as doodly fuck and kiss my bender. They were exclamations both zen and profane. I thought I was going to end up spending the night out here. Then I saw the light. Beav raised his hand roofwards, fingers spread. "See the light! Lord, yes, sir! Praise G!" His hands started to unfog then, and he saw the stranger on the couch. He lowered his hands slowly, then smiled. That was one of the reasons Jonesy had loved him ever since grade school. Although the Beav could be tiresome and wasn't the brightest bulb in the chandelier by any means, his first reaction to the unplanned and unexpected wasn't a frown, but a smile. "Hi," he said. "I'm Joe Clarendon. Who are you?" "Rick McCarthy," he said, and got to his feet. The comforter tumbled off him, and Jonesy saw he had a pretty good potbelly poaching out the front of his sweater. Well, he thought, nothing strange about that. At least, it's the middle-aged man's disease, and it's going to kill us in our millions during the next 20 years or so. McCarthy stuck out his hand, started to step forward, and almost tripped over the fallen comforter. If Jonesy hadn't reached out and grabbed his shoulder, steadying him, McCarthy probably would have fallen forward, very likely cleaning out the coffee table on which the food was now set. Again, Jonesy was struck by the man's queer ungainliness. It made him think of himself a little that past spring, as he had learned to walk all over again. He got a closer look at the patch on the guy's cheek and sort of wished he hadn't. It wasn't frostbite at all. It looked like a skin tumor of some kind, or perhaps a port wine stain with a stubble growing out of it. Whoa, shake it, but don't break it," Beaver said, springing forward. He grabbed McCarthy's hand and pumped it until Jonesy thought McCarthy would end up swan diving into the coffee table after all. He was glad when the Beav, all 5 feet 6 of him, with snow still melting into that long black hippie hair, stepped back. The Beav was still smiling, more broadly than ever. With the shoulder-length hair and the thick glasses, he looked like either a math genius or a serial killer. In fact, he was a carpenter. "Rick's here had a time of it," Jonesy said. "Got lost yesterday and spent last night in the woods." Beaver's smile stayed on, but became concerned. Jonesy had an idea what was coming next and willed Beaver would not say it. He had gotten the impression that McCarthy was a fairly religious man who might not care much for profanity, but of course asking Beaver to clean up his mouth was like asking wind not to blow. "Bitch in a buzzsaw," he cried now. "That's fucking terrible. Sit down, eat. You too, Jonesy." "Nah," Jonesy said. "You go on and eat that. You're the one who just came in out of the snow." "You sure?" "I am. I'll just scramble myself some eggs." "Rick can catch you up on this story. Maybe it will make more sense to you than it does to me," he thought. "Okay." Beaver took off his jacket, red, and his vest, orange of course. He started to toss them on the woodpile, then thought better of it. Wait, got something you might want." He stuck his hand deep into one of the pockets of his down jacket, rummaged, and came out with a paperback book, considerably bent, but seemingly none the worse for wear otherwise. Little devils with pitchforks danced across the cover. Small Vices by Robert Parker. It was the book Jonesy had been reading in the stand. The beeve held it out to him, smiling. I left your sleeping bag, but I figured you wouldn't be able to sleep tonight unless you know who the fuck done it. You shouldn't have gone up there, Jonesy said. But he was touched in a way only Beaver could touch him. The beeve had come back through the blowing snow and hadn't been able to make out if Jonesy was up in the tree stand or not for sure. He could have called, but for Beeve, calling wasn't enough. Only seeing was believing. Not a problem, Beaver said, and sat down next to McCarthy, who was looking at him as a person might look at a new and rather exotic kind of a small animal. Well, thanks, Jonesy said. You get around that sandwich, I'm going to do eggs. He started away, then stopped. What about Pete and Henry? You think they'll make it back okay? The beeve opened his mouth, but before he could answer, the wind gasped around the cabin again, making the walls creak and rising to a grim whistle in the eaves. Oh, this is just a cap of snow, Beaver said. Then the gust died away. They'll make it back. Getting out again if there comes another norther, that might be a different story. He began to gobble the grilled cheese sandwich. Jonesy went over to the kitchen to scramble some eggs and heat up another can of soup. He felt better about McCarthy now that Beaver was here. The truth was, he always felt better when the beeve was around. Crazy, but true. 4. By the time he got the eggs crumbled and the soup hot, McCarthy was chatting away to Beaver as if the two of them had been friends for the last 10 years. If McCarthy was offended by Beeve's litany of mostly comic profanity, that was outweighed by Beeve's considerable charm. There's no explaining it. Henry had once told Jonesy, "He's a trouble, that's all. You can't help liking him. It's why his bed is never empty. It sure isn't his looks women respond to." Jonesy brought his eggs and soup into the living area. Working not to limp, it was amazing how much more his hip hurt in bad weather. He had always thought that was an old wives' tale, but apparently it was not, and sat in one of the chairs at the end of the couch. McCarthy had been doing more talking than eating, it seemed. He'd barely touched his soup and had eaten only half of his grilled cheese. "How you boys doing?" Jonesy asked. He shook pepper onto his eggs and fell to with a will. His appetite had made a complete comeback, it seemed. "We are two happy home masters," Beaver said, but although he sounded as chipper as ever, Jonesy thought he looked worried, perhaps even alarmed. "Rick's been telling me about his adventures. It's as good as his story as one of those men's magazines they had in the barbershop when I was a kid." He turned back to McCarthy, still smiling. That was the beeve, always smiling, and flicked a hand through the heavy fall of his black hair. "Old man Castengay was the barber on our side of Derry when I was a kid, and he scared me so fucking bad with those clippers of his that I've been staying away from them ever since." McCarthy gave a weak smile but made no reply. He picked up the other half of the cheese sandwich, looked at it, then put it back down again. The red mark on his cheek glowed like a brand. Beaver, meanwhile, rushed on, as if he was afraid of what McCarthy might say if given half a chance. Outside it was snowing harder than ever, blowing too, and Jonesy thought of Henry and Pete out there, probably on the deep-cut road by now in Henry's old Scout. Not only did Rick here just about get eaten up by something in the middle of the night, a bear, he thinks it was, he lost his rifle too, a brand new Remington, 30 fucking A, you won't even see that again, not a chance in 100,000. "I know," McCarthy said. The color was fading out of his cheeks again, that leaden look coming back in. "I don't even remember when I put it down or—" There was a sudden, low rasping noise, like a locust. Jonesy felt the hair on the back of his neck stiffen, thinking it was something caught in the fireplace chimney. Then he realized it was McCarthy. Jonesy had heard some loud farts in his time, some long ones too, but nothing like this. It seemed to go on forever, although it couldn't have been more than few seconds. Then the smell hit. McCarthy had picked up his spoon. Now he dropped it back into his barely touched soup and raised his right hand to his blemished cheek in an almost girlish gesture of embarrassment. "Oh gosh, I'm sorry," he said. "Not a bit. More room out than there is in," Beaver said. But there was just instinct running his mouth. Instinct and the habits of a lifetime. Jonesy could see he was as shocked by that smell as Jonesy was himself. It wasn't the sulphurous rotten egg odor that made you laugh and roll your eyes and wave your hand in front of your face yelling, "Ah, Jesus, who cut the cheese?" Nor one of those methane swamp gas farts either. It was the smell Jonesy had detected on McCarthy's breath, only stronger, a mixture of ether and overripe bananas, like the starter fluid you shot into your carburetor on a sub-zero morning. "Oh dear, that's awful," McCarthy said. "I'm so darn sorry." "It's all right, really," Jonesy said, but his stomach had curled up into a ball, like something protecting itself from assault. He wouldn't be finishing his own early lunch. No way in hell could he finish it. He wasn't prissy about farts as a rule, but this one really reeked. The beef got up from the couch and opened a window, letting in a swirl of snow and draft of blessedly fresh air. "Don't worry about it, partner, but that is pretty ripe. What the hell have you been eating? Woodchuck turds?" "Bushes and moss and other stuff. I don't know just what," McCarthy said. "I was just so hungry, I had to eat something, but I don't know much about that sort of thing. Never read any of those books by Yule Gibbons, and of course it was dark." He said this last almost as if struck by an inspiration, and Jonesy looked up at Beaver, catching his eye as if to see if Beaver knew what Jonesy did. McCarthy was lying. McCarthy didn't know what he'd eaten in the woods, or if he had eaten anything at all. He just wanted to explain that ghastly, unexpected frog's croak, and the stench which had followed it. The wind gusted again, a big gaspy whoop that sent a fresh skein of snow in through the open window, but at least it was turning the air over,